The woman in the corner wasn't supposed to be there. She stood perfectly still, hands folded, watching the crowd of donors and socialites swirl around the charity dinner like she was studying specimens behind glass. Her tailored black suit screamed money, but her eyes screamed something else entirely, something that made people step away without knowing why. The whispers had already started throughout the Renaissance Hotel's grand ballroom, where crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in white linen. Who does she think she is? So arrogant doesn't even try to mingle. But across the room, a man in a borrowed tie was watching too, his 8-year-old daughter tugging at his sleeve. Jack Reynolds saw what everyone else missed. He saw the slight tremor in her fingers, the way she pressed her lips together when someone laughed too loudly, the careful distance she kept not from superiority, but from something that looked suspiciously like fear. What Jack didn't know yet was that in exactly 17 minutes, his daughter would accidentally change everything. The words he'd speak in a language none of these people expected him to know would reveal a truth that would make every assumption in that room crumble like paper in rain. Jack adjusted his tie for the third time, feeling like a fraud in the borrowed suit. The grand ballroom buzzed with the kind of energy that came from people who wrote checks with more zeros than most folks saw in a year. Conversations flowed as freely as the top-shelf whiskey being poured by servers in pristine uniforms. Emma's small hand gripped his calloused fingers tighter than usual. Why is everyone dressed like they're going to a wedding? Jack knelt down to her level, his weathered hand straightening the collar of her best dress, a hand-me-down from a neighbor's daughter, but you'd never know it from the way Emma carried herself. Because sometimes when people have important things to talk about, they like to dress up for it. His eyes scanned the room again, immediately regretting their decision to attend. The invitation had come through Emma's school, something about recognizing families who'd shown resilience in tough times. The guidance counselor had been insistent, mentioning scholarships and opportunities. Jack never could say no when it came to Emma's future. But standing here now, surrounded by people whose monthly car payments probably exceeded his rent, he felt every callus on his hands, every grass stain on his work boots he'd tried unsuccessfully to buff out. Their world was so far removed from the modest apartment they shared, from the mechanical garage where he spent his days with grease-stained hands, from the memory of military service that had once given his life structure and purpose. The woman in the corner caught his attention again, not because she stood out, but because she seemed to be trying so hard not to. While everyone else moved in clusters, air-kissing and name-dropping, she remained statue still against the far wall. Her black suit was immaculate, her dark hair pulled back in a perfect shiny knot. But there was something in her posture that reminded Jack of Emma on her first day at a new school, dogged courage on the surface, uncertainty underneath. She looked sad, Emma observed, following his gaze with a directness that made Jack both proud and terrified of what might come out of her mouth next. Before Jack could respond, the conversation at the nearest table drifted their way, carried by the kind of voices that were used to being heard. That's her, the tech CEO, Miyuki Tanaka, Japanese-American. Word is she donated $2 million to the cause. Jack's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression neutral as the conversation continued. But look at her just standing there. Doesn't even try to socialize. I heard she's brilliant with computers, but terrible with people. Probably why she's still single at her age. Emma's hand found his again, her small fingers intertwining with his larger ones in a gesture that had become their silent code for people are being mean again. I heard she donated more than anyone else, but won't even join a table. What's the point of coming if you're just going to stand there like a statue? The irony wasn't lost on Jack. Here they were at a charity dinner, supposed to bring people together, and the person who'd contributed the most was being dissected by people who probably donated enough to write off on their taxes, but not enough to actually make a dent in their lifestyle. Jack had seen this before. The subtle judgments, the casual cruelty dressed up in cocktail party politeness. It never failed to make his stomach turn. During his time in Japan, he'd experienced firsthand how easily people dismissed those who communicated differently, how quickly they labeled someone as cold or distant simply because they expressed themselves through different cultural lenses. Emma tugged on his sleeve again, her eyes still fixed on the woman in the corner. Can we go say hi to the sad lady? Jack hesitated, watching as another group approached. Miyuki exchanged a few words, then drifted away with barely concealed expressions of confusion or irritation. Whatever was happening over there wasn't going well. Part of him wanted to stay safely anonymous. He and Emma were already fish out of water here. Drawing attention to themselves seemed unwise. But Emma was already moving her natural fearlessness, overriding his adult caution. Grace, wait. His whisper was lost in the ambient noise of the ballroom as she navigated between tables with the determined stride of a child on a mission. Jack hurried after her, catching apologetic glances from other diners as he followed. Emma navigated the room like a heat-seeking missile aimed directly at the most untouchable person in the building. Miyuki noticed them coming. Jack could see her shoulders tense slightly, her grip on the plate tightening as she prepared for whatever awkward interaction was about to unfold. He'd seen that look before, the expression of someone who'd learned to brace for impact every time another human being approached. Emma came to a stop directly in front of her, tilting her head back to meet Miyuki's startled gaze. "Hi, I'm Emma. You look like you could use a friend." For a moment, Miyuki just stared at her as if Emma had spoken in a foreign language. Then something flickered across her features, surprise perhaps, or recognition of something unexpected. "Hello, Emma," she said softly, and Jack was struck by how different her voice sounded from what he'd expected, gentler, warmer, with just the faintest hint of an accent. "I'm Miyuki. Are you here by yourself?" Emma asked with the kind of directness that made adults squirm, but somehow felt perfectly natural coming from her. "Yes," Miyuki admitted. "I suppose I am. That's sad. My dad says nobody should have to eat fancy food alone. It makes it taste weird." Emma gestured toward Jack, who had finally caught up and now stood slightly behind his daughter, ready to apologize for whatever social boundary she might be about to cross. "I'm sorry about this." Emma sometimes gets these ideas in her head, and there's no stopping her. Miyuki's eyes met his for the first time, and Jack felt something electric pass between them. Not romantic exactly, but a kind of recognition, like looking into a mirror and seeing not your own reflection, but someone who understood what it felt like to be perpetually out of place in a world that seemed designed for everyone else. "Your daughter is very kind," Miyuki said, and there was something in her tone that suggested she wasn't used to unexpected kindness. "She has a gift for finding people who need it most," Jack replied, and immediately felt foolish for the presumption. "I'm sorry, I don't mean to suggest that you need I do," Miyuki interrupted quietly. "Need it, I mean? More than you might think." Emma, oblivious to the adult undercurrent swirling around her, reached out and tugged gently on Miyuki's sleeve. "Do you want to sit with us? Our table has extra chairs, and I can tell you about my butterfly collection." For the first time since Jack had noticed her, Miyuki smiled a real smile that transformed her entire face, softening the sharp angles and bringing warmth to her eyes. "I would like that very much." As they made their way back toward Jack's table, he couldn't help but notice the ripple of whispers that followed in their wake. Heads turned and eyebrows raised, conversations paused mid-sentence as people processed the unexpected alliance between the mysterious CEO and the obviously out-of-place father-daughter duo. "Interesting choice in dinner companions," someone murmured as they passed. "Wonder what she wants from them," came another voice. Jack's jaw clenched again, but Miyuki seemed either oblivious to the comments or well-practiced at ignoring them. She settled into the chair Emma indicated with a gracefulness that suggested she was used to being watched, used to having her every movement scrutinized and cataloged for future judgment. So Emma began without preamble. "What kind of work do you do?" "My dad fixes cars, which is super cool because he gets to use lots of tools, and sometimes he lets me help by holding the flashlight." Miyuki's smile widened slightly. "I work with computers and technology. My company makes software that helps people communicate with each other across different countries and cultures." "Like Google Translate?" Emma asked, her eyes lighting up with interest. "Similar but more complex. We focus on helping businesses understand each other when they speak different languages or come from different cultures." Jack found himself leaning forward, slightly intrigued despite himself. It was the first time all evening he'd heard Miyuki speak with any enthusiasm, and the change in her demeanor was remarkable. Gone was the carefully controlled stillness, replaced by something that looked almost like passion. "That sounds important," he said. "Must be challenging work." "It is." Miyuki's gaze met his again, and he caught a flash of something that might have been gratitude for his genuine interest. People often assume that language barriers are just about vocabulary, but it's so much more than that: cultural context, nonverbal communication, social hierarchies, They all play a role in how we understand each other. Or misunderstand each other. Like when Dad tried to order coffee in Spanish at that new place, and they brought him soup instead, Emma offered helpfully. Jack chuckled, feeling heat creep up his neck. My Spanish needs work. Exactly like that, Miyuki agreed, the corners of her eyes crinkling with amusement. But imagine that happening in a business negotiation worth millions of dollars or during a diplomatic meeting between countries. There was something almost vulnerable in the way she said it, as if he'd touched on something she'd been thinking about all evening. Jack understood that feeling of having something important to say, something you believed in deeply, but being unable to make others see its value. Emma, meanwhile, had finished her analysis of Miyuki's explanation and moved on to more pressing matters. Do you have any kids? No, Miyuki replied, and Jack caught the slight tightening around her eyes. No, I don't. That's okay. Some people are too busy for kids. Or maybe they're waiting for the right person to have them with. My dad was married to my mom, but she died when I was little, so now it's just us. But we're pretty good at taking care of each other, aren't we, Dad? Jack felt heat creep up his neck. Emma's casual revelation of their family situation always caught him off guard, especially in social settings like this, where single parenthood seemed to come with its own set of assumptions and judgments. We are, he agreed softly. Miyuki was quiet for a long moment, studying both of them with an expression Jack couldn't quite read. When she spoke again, her voice was gentler than it had been all evening. You're very lucky to have each other. We think so, Emma said matter-of-factly. But sometimes I wish Dad had more friends. He works a lot and doesn't talk to many people except for me, and sometimes Mr. Rodriguez, who owns the garage. Jack wished he could disappear into the floor. His 8-year-old daughter had just essentially announced to a stranger that he was a friendless workaholic with no social life, which, to be fair, wasn't entirely inaccurate, but still wasn't something he needed broadcast at a charity dinner. Emma, he started, but Miyuki held up a hand. It's okay. Friendship can be complicated when you're an adult, especially when your circumstances are different from most people's. She glanced around the room, taking in the clusters of animated conversation, the easy familiarity between people who moved in the same social circles. Sometimes it feels easier to just focus on what you can control. There was something in her tone that made Jack suspect she wasn't just talking about him. The words resonated with his own experience, the way he'd withdrawn into his work in his role as Emma's father after his wife died, finding it easier to pour his energy into those clear responsibilities than to navigate the messy terrain of adult relationships. Before he could respond, the evening's host had returned to the microphone at the front of the room. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please. We're honored tonight to have several special guests who have made significant contributions to our educational initiatives. I'd like to invite Miyuki Tanaka, CEO of Global Bridge Technologies, to say a few words about the importance of cross-cultural understanding in education. A spotlight swung toward their table, bathing Miyuki in brilliant white light. Jack saw her stiffen her hands gripping the edge of the table as hundreds of eyes turned in their direction. The casual warmth that had been growing between them evaporated instantly, replaced by the same careful control he'd noticed when she was standing alone by the wall. I should go, she said quietly, more to herself than to them. You've got this, Emma whispered with the fierce confidence that only children possess. Just talk to them like you talk to us. Miyuki looked down at her for a moment, something unreadable passing across her face. Then she straightened her shoulders and walked toward the podium with the kind of measured grace that spoke of years of practice moving through hostile territory. Jack watched her go, already dreading what was about to unfold. He'd seen enough workplace presentations, enough community meetings to recognize the signs. The room had that particular energy that came when people had already made up their minds about someone, when they were waiting not to be convinced, but to have their existing prejudices confirmed. Miyuki reached the podium and adjusted the microphone with steady hands. When she began to speak, her voice was clear and professional, but Jack could hear the slight tension underneath. Thank you for having me tonight. As many of you know, Global Bridge Technologies focuses on breaking down communication barriers between cultures and countries. We believe that education is the foundation of understanding, and understanding is the foundation of peace. It was a good opening, clear, concise, relevant to the cause they were supposedly all there to support. But Jack could already see the problem. Miyuki's presentation style was different from what this crowd expected. Where they wanted emotional appeals and personal anecdotes, she was giving them data and logical arguments. Where they expected the kind of performative warmth that came naturally to professional fundraisers, she was offering genuine passion, filtered through a more reserved cultural lens. In our research, we found that 87% of international business conflicts stem not from genuine disagreements, but from cultural miscommunication. Simple things like eye contact, personal space, and the directness of language can create misunderstandings that escalate into major problems. Jack found himself nodding along. It made perfect sense to him. He'd seen similar dynamics play out in smaller ways at the garage where customers from different backgrounds sometimes clashed with mechanics over communication styles rather than actual service issues. But looking around the room, he could see that Miyuki was losing her audience. Conversations were starting at nearby tables, phones were emerging from purses, and the general energy was shifting from polite attention to barely concealed boredom. That's why our scholarship program focuses not just on language acquisition, but on cultural competency. Miyuki pressed on, either unaware of or choosing to ignore the growing restlessness. We're not just teaching children to speak different languages. We're teaching them to understand different ways of thinking, different ways of being in the world. "Excuse me," came a voice from one of the front tables. Jack recognized the woman who'd been gossiping about Miyuki earlier, her diamond earrings catching the light as she turned toward the podium. "This all sounds very academic, but what I'm hearing is a lot of theory and not much heart. Can you tell us something personal? Something that shows us why this matters to you?" It was a reasonable question, the kind that any experienced public speaker should have been prepared for. But Jack watched Miyuki's face and saw something that looked like panic flicker across her features. Her hands gripped the sides of the podium tighter, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its steadiness. What matters is the data. The research shows clear benefits to cultural education programs, and our pilot initiatives have demonstrated measurable improvements in cross-cultural competency among participants." "But why do you care?" the woman pressed, and there was something almost predatory in her persistence. "What's your personal connection to this cause? Help us understand why we should trust you with our donations." The room had gone completely quiet now, all pretense of polite multitasking abandoned, as everyone waited to see how Miyuki would respond. Jack could feel the tension building, could see the way Miyuki's composure was starting to crack, under the pressure of being asked to perform emotional vulnerability for a room full of strangers who had already decided she was too cold, too foreign, too different to be trusted with their money. "My personal connection," Miyuki repeated slowly as if the words themselves were foreign to her. I mean the work speaks for itself. The outcomes demonstrate." "We don't want outcomes," another voice interrupted. "We want to know who you are. Why should we believe you understand what American children need when you seem so disconnected from American values?" Jack felt Emma tense beside him. His daughter might only be 8, but she had finely tuned antennae for when adults were being cruel to each other. He put a protective arm around her shoulders, wishing he could somehow shield Miyuki from what was happening at the podium. "I'm sorry if I seem disconnected," Miyuki said, and for the first time Jack heard something like hurt creeping into her voice. "I've lived in America for most of my life, but I understand that my communication style might be different from what you're used to. In my culture, we often express care through actions rather than words, through dedication to excellence rather than emotional displays." "Your culture." The diamond earring woman latched onto the phrase like a weapon. "So you admit you don't consider yourself American?" It was a trap, and everyone in the room knew it. Answer yes, and she'd be accused of being a perpetual foreigner who could never truly understand American needs. Answer no, and she'd be called a liar for having just referenced cultural differences. Jack watched Miyuki stand frozen at the podium, caught between impossible choices, and felt something hot and protective surge through his chest. Around them, the whispers were starting again, louder now, and less concerned with discretion. "I knew there was something off about her. 2 million doesn't mean anything if she's just using it to push her own agenda. Typical. They come here and expect us to adapt to them instead of the other way around." Emma's small hand found Jack's larger one under the table. "Dad," she whispered, "they're being really mean to the nice lady." Jack squeezed her fingers gently, his mind racing. He could stay silent, let this play out however it was going to play out, and take Emma home to their small apartment where they could pretend none of this had happened. It would be the safe choice, the smart choice for a man who had learned to keep his head down and avoid drawing attention to himself and his daughter. But looking at Miyuki's face, seeing the careful mask she wore starting to crumble under the weight of casual cruelty disguised as concerned questions, Jack realized he couldn't live with that choice. Not when he knew something these people didn't not, when he had the power to change the entire trajectory of this evening with just a few words. He stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor loud enough to draw attention. Emma looked up at him with wide eyes, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Around the room, heads turned in his direction, curious about the disruption from the clearly out-of-place man in the borrowed suit. Jack walked toward the podium with steady steps, his work boots echoing against the polished floor. He could feel the weight of hundreds of stares, could hear the murmur of confusion spreading through the crowd. Who was this nobody? What did he think he was doing? When he reached Miyuki, she looked at him with a mixture of surprise and something that might have been hope. Up close, he could see that her hands were trembling slightly, though she kept them carefully controlled at her sides. "Excuse me," Jack said into the microphone, his voice carrying easily across the now silent room. "I'd like to say something, if that's all right." The host looked confused but nodded, probably too surprised to object. Jack turned to face the audience, taking in their expectant faces, their barely concealed impatience with this unexpected interruption from someone who clearly didn't belong. "My name is Jack Reynolds," he began, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "I'm a mechanic. I fix cars for a living, and I'm here tonight because my daughter's school thought it might be good for us to see what real generosity looks like." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the room, making eye contact with as many people as he could. "But what I've seen instead is a woman being attacked for the crime of being different, for not performing emotion the way you expect her to, for not fitting into your narrow definition of what American looks like." A ripple of uncomfortable shifting went through the audience. The diamond earring woman started to interrupt, but Jack held up a hand. "You want to know her personal connection to this cause? You want to know why she cares? Maybe the question you should be asking is why a woman who's already contributed more money than most of us will see in a lifetime feels like she has to justify herself to people who've decided she's not good enough before she even opened her mouth." There was a moment of stunned silence. Jack hadn't planned to speak so forcefully, but the words were coming from a place of recognition, of seeing in Miyuki's isolation a reflection of his own. He turned slightly toward her, seeing the shock in her eyes. Then he did something that made the entire room go completely silent. He spoke to her in fluent Japanese. "Tanaka-san, anata wa hitori janai desu. Watashi wa wakarimasu." "Miyuki, you are not alone. I understand." Miyuki's eyes widened, her carefully maintained composure cracking completely. She responded without thinking, the words tumbling out in her native language. "Doshite nihongo ga wakarimasu ka?" "How do you know Japanese?" Jack switched back to English so the rest of the room could understand. "I served in the U.S. military, stationed at Yokosuka Naval Base for 3 years. After my discharge, I stayed in Japan, working for Toyota as a mechanical engineer for another 5 years. That's where I first encountered Miyuki's company." He turned back to the audience, seeing their confusion, their struggle to process this unexpected twist. Global Bridge Technologies was contracted to help foreign employees understand Japanese workplace culture. Their program didn't just teach us language. It taught us respect. It taught us that different doesn't mean wrong. Miyuki was crying now, tears streaming down her face as years of careful emotional control finally gave way. "I remember you," she said softly into the microphone. "You were part of the pilot program in Nagoya. You asked the best questions. You understood what we were trying to do." "Because I was an outsider too," Jack replied. "I know what it feels like to be judged for being different, to have people assume you don't belong before they even get to know you." He faced the audience again, his voice growing stronger. "This woman didn't just donate $2 million to your cause. She created an educational framework that's being used in schools across 3 continents. She's personally mentored dozens of young professionals from underrepresented backgrounds." The room was dead silent now, the weight of Jack's words settling over the crowd like a heavy blanket. Even the servers had stopped moving, frozen in place, as they watched this unexpected drama unfold. "You asked for something personal." Jack continued, his voice rough with emotion. "How about this? When my wife was diagnosed with cancer while we were living in Japan, Miyuki's company made sure I had access to translators for every doctor's appointment. They arranged for my wife's parents to fly over from the States. They gave me flexible hours so I could be with her during treatments. His voice cracked slightly, the memories still raw even after all these years. She did that not because she had to, but because she understood what it meant to be lost in a foreign place when everything was falling apart. Emma had appeared at his side, somehow slipping through the crowd with the determined purpose that had brought her to Miyuki's corner in the first place. She took Miyuki's hand in her small one, offering the kind of uncomplicated comfort that only children can provide. "The reason Miyuki seems distant to you," Jack said, his voice growing quieter, but somehow more powerful, "is because she's spent years having to prove herself to people who decided she wasn't good enough before she walked in the room. She's learned to protect herself by keeping her emotions private, by letting her work speak for itself, but that doesn't make her cold. It makes her careful." He looked directly at the woman who had been leading the attack. "You want to know what American values look like? How about judging people by their actions instead of their accent? How about recognizing generosity when it's standing right in front of you? How about having the grace to admit when you've been wrong?" The silence that followed was absolute. Jack could hear his own heart pounding in his ears, could feel Emma's hand gripping his tightly as if to say, "I'm proud of you, Dad." Miyuki stepped closer to the microphone, her voice still shaky but growing stronger. "Jack is right. I do keep my emotions private. In Japanese culture, we show respect through restraint, care through dedication. When I see a problem, my instinct is to solve it, not to talk about how it makes me feel." She paused, wiping tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand. "But maybe I've been so focused on not being too much that I forgot how to be enough. I've been so afraid of being seen as the cold, calculating Asian businesswoman that I stopped letting people see who I really am." The transformation in the room was palpable. People who had been hostile minutes before now looked uncomfortable, shamed, some openly emotional, as the reality of their behavior sank in. The host cleared his throat, stepping forward as if to regain control of the evening. "I think we owe Ms. Tanaka an apology," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system. "And our gratitude not just for her generous donation, but for her patience with our misconceptions." A smattering of applause began somewhere in the back of the room, growing stronger as more people joined in, but Miyuki held up a hand, stopping the applause before it could build momentum. "Thank you. But what I'd really like is to start over," she said, "to tell you about the program we're funding and why it matters. Not because I'm trying to impose my culture on anyone, but because I believe children deserve to grow up in a world where being different isn't seen as being wrong." She looked down at Emma, who was still holding her hand with the fierce loyalty that had become her signature. "This young lady taught me something important tonight. She didn't see my expensive suit or my foreign name or my uncomfortable body language. She saw someone who looked sad and decided that wasn't acceptable. That's the kind of thinking we want to encourage in our children, the ability to look past surface differences and see the human being underneath." The second half of Miyuki's presentation was nothing like the first. Gone was the careful distance, the reliance on data over emotion. Instead, she spoke about growing up caught between two cultures, about the scholarship students she'd mentored, who reminded her of herself at their age, about the moment she'd realized that her success meant nothing if she couldn't use it to make things easier for the people coming behind her. She talked about Jack's work in Japan, how he'd been one of the few Americans who truly embraced cultural exchange rather than simply tolerating it. She spoke about the day he'd asked her to help him understand the Japanese concept of ikigai, life's purpose, because he wanted to find meaning in his work beyond just collecting a paycheck. "That's what this program is really about," she concluded. "Not just teaching children to speak different languages, but teaching them to find their ikigai in building bridges instead of walls. Teaching them that understanding each other isn't just politically correct. It's the foundation of every innovation, every breakthrough, every moment of human progress we've ever achieved." When she finished, the applause was genuine, sustained, and came from people who were really listening for the first time all evening. Jack saw tears in eyes that had been hard and judgmental 20 minutes earlier. He saw people looking at each other with something that might have been shame, but also with something that looked like possibility. As the formal program concluded and people began moving toward the reception area, Miyuki remained at the podium for a moment, looking out at the crowd with an expression Jack couldn't quite read. When she finally stepped down, Emma immediately attached herself to her side. "That was much better. Emma announced with the authority of someone who'd been critiquing public presentations her entire 8 years of life. You sounded like yourself that time. Miyuki laughed a real laugh that transformed her entire face. Thank you, Emma. You're an excellent critic. I told you she just needed a friend, Emma said to Jack, with the satisfaction of someone whose predictions had come true. Over the next hour, something remarkable happened. People who had been avoiding Miyuki all evening began approaching her not with the superficial networking energy Jack had observed earlier, but with genuine curiosity and what appeared to be authentic contrition. Conversations formed around their small group, real conversations about cultural differences in educational philosophy, and the challenges of raising children in an increasingly connected world. Jack found himself in the strange position of being Miyuki's translator, not linguistically but culturally helping bridge the gap between her more reserved communication style and the expectations of people who were genuinely trying to understand. It was work he'd done before in different contexts, and he was surprised by how naturally it came back to him. You know, Miyuki said to him during a brief lull in the conversations, I never properly thanked you for what you did back then. Your insights were invaluable to refining our training programs. Jack felt heat creep up his neck. He'd hoped that particular detail might get lost in the larger story, but apparently Miyuki's memory was as sharp as ever. You don't need to thank me. Your program helped me navigate the most difficult period of my life. The language training, the cultural orientation, it made all the difference when Elizabeth got sick. Emma was listening with the intense focus she brought to any story about her mother storing away details about a woman she'd been too young to remember, but still missed with the fierce loyalty of a child's love. Your wife sounds like she was wonderful, Miyuki said to Emma. Jack told me how smart and funny she was when we worked together. She was, Emma agreed solemnly. Dad says I have her smile, but his stubborn streak, which is why I always win arguments. Miyuki laughed again, and Jack was struck by how much younger she looked when she wasn't carrying the weight of other people's expectations. I can see that. You certainly won me over tonight. As the evening wound down and people began making their goodbyes, Jack realized he was reluctant to see it end, not because of the elegant surroundings or the excellent food, but because of the unexpected connection he'd found with someone who understood what it felt like to be perpetually between worlds. Would you like to have coffee sometime? Miyuki asked as they gathered their things. I mean, if you're interested, I know you're busy with work and Emma, but I thought maybe we could continue some of these conversations. Jack felt Emma's elbow dig into his ribs with the subtlety of a freight train. That sounds great, he said, meaning it more than he'd meant anything in a long time. As they walked toward the exit, Emma skipping slightly ahead of them, Miyuki spoke quietly. Thank you for what you did tonight. No one's ever stood up for me like that before. Jack looked at her, really looked at her, seeing not the untouchable CEO from earlier in the evening, but a woman who, despite all her success, still battled the same insecurities and loneliness that he did. Sometimes we all need someone to remind the world who we really are, he said. Someone who sees past all the armor we put up. Miyuki smiled a genuine smile that reached her eyes. And sometimes we need an 8-year-old to remind us that it's okay to just ask someone if they want to be friends. They stepped outside into the cool evening air where the valet was bringing around cars worth more than Jack's annual salary. His beat-up pickup truck would look ridiculous next to the luxury vehicles, but for the first time all night, he didn't care. There was something freeing about having already exposed the most vulnerable parts of yourself and finding acceptance anyway. Emma tugged at his sleeve again, pointing up at the night sky where a few stars were visible despite the city lights. Dad, look. Remember what you always say about stars? Jack smiled, putting an arm around his daughter's shoulders. That they're the same stars no matter where you are in the world. Miyuki followed their gaze upward, her expression thoughtful. My grandmother used to tell me that too. That whenever I felt alone, I should remember that we're all under the same sky. For a moment, the three of them stood together looking up at the vast expanse above them. A mechanic who'd once been an engineer, a CEO who'd built bridges between cultures, and a little girl who saw the world with the kind of clarity adults had forgotten. Three people who had entered the evening as strangers and would leave it having found something unexpected. A connection that transcended the artificial barriers of class and culture and circumstance. It was Emma who broke the silence, practical as always. So when are we having coffee? Can I come too? I want to hear more about Japan. And butterflies. Do they have different butterflies there? Jack and Miyuki exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. the shared understanding of two adults who recognized in each other a kindred spirit, someone who knew what it meant to rebuild a life from scratch, to navigate a world that didn't always have a place for people who didn't fit neatly into predefined boxes. They have the most beautiful butterflies you've ever seen, Miyuki told Emma, including one called the Great Purple Emperor that looks like flying jewelry. As they said their goodbyes and promised to meet soon, Jack felt something shifting inside him, a loosening of the protective shell he'd built around himself and Emma. After Elizabeth died, a cautious opening to possibilities he'd stopped allowing himself to imagine. For years, he'd defined himself solely through his roles: mechanic, father, provider. Tonight, he'd remembered other parts of himself, the man who'd once lived fearlessly in a foreign country, who'd learned another language and culture, who'd found purpose in building understanding between different worlds. Looking at Emma chatting animatedly with Miyuki about Japanese butterflies, Jack realized that maybe the greatest gift he could give his daughter wasn't just stability or security, but the courage to remain open to the world despite its complexities and contradictions. To show her that sometimes the bravest thing you could do wasn't to avoid pain or judgment, but to step directly into the spotlight and speak your truth even when your voice shook. As they walked toward his truck, the night air cool against their faces, Jack thought about bridges. Not just the metaphorical kind Miyuki's company built between cultures, but the real ones that connected separate shores, that made passage possible between places that would otherwise remain divided by impassable waters. Bridges didn't eliminate the differences between the places they connected. They simply created a path to move between them, a way to experience both sides and find value in each. Maybe that's what tonight had been about, not erasing differences or pretending they didn't exist, but creating pathways between separate worlds, finding the courage to cross over, and the wisdom to carry the best of each side with you. Maybe that's what healing looked like after loss, not forgetting the shore you'd left behind, but building a bridge to somewhere new, somewhere that had room for both memory and possibility. Emma's hand slipped into his as they reached the truck, her small fingers warm and sure. "You did good tonight, Dad," she said with the simple certainty of a child who believed in him absolutely. "You helped the sad lady not be sad anymore." Jack smiled down at his daughter, this remarkable human who somehow managed to see right to the heart of things. "You're the one who saw her first, kiddo. I just followed your lead." And maybe that was the most important bridge of all, the one between a father and daughter, between the world as it was and the world as it could be, between the caution of experience and the courage of innocence. A bridge that, like all the most important ones, had to be crossed every day, rebuilt with each sunrise, strengthened with each small act of understanding and connection. Tomorrow they would return to their normal lives, to the garage with its smells of motor oil and metal, to the small apartment with its second-hand furniture and walls covered in Emma's artwork, to the daily routines that structured their existence. But something would be different. Something had shifted. A door had opened, or perhaps a window letting in fresh air and new possibilities. As Jack started the engine, he caught sight of Miyuki in his rearview mirror, standing under the hotel portico, watching them leave, her hand raised in farewell. For a moment, she looked like she belonged to a different world entirely, a world of corporate boardrooms and international finance, of power and privilege and carefully constructed facades. But then Emma rolled down her window and shouted a goodbye, and Miyuki's formal posture dissolved into a genuine wave, her smile visible even from a distance. And in that moment, the distance between their worlds didn't seem so vast after all, just a gap waiting to be bridged by those brave enough to build the first span. As they drove away into the night, Jack felt a sense of peace settle over him. Not the resigned calm of someone who had accepted limitation, but the quiet confidence of someone who had remembered that bridges could be built where none had existed before, that connections could be forged across even the widest divides, that humans had been finding their way to each other across seemingly insurmountable differences for as long as there had been language to speak and hearts to understand. And sometimes it just took a child's simple question: "Can we go say hi to the sad lady?" to start building that bridge one plank at a time. The first sounds Jack heard were Emma's excited footsteps racing down the hallway. "Dad, Dad, Dad, you're going to be late for coffee with Miyuki." Jack glanced at his watch and felt a jolt of panic. After 3 days of increased business at Rodriguez's garage, spring always brought a surge of vehicles needing service after winter. He'd nearly forgotten about their planned meeting. Emma, however, had been counting down the hours since Wednesday night's charity dinner. He wiped his hands on a shop towel, the stubborn grease from the transmission he'd been rebuilding, refusing to fully surrender. The bathroom mirror reflected a man who looked decidedly unprepared for coffee with a CEO, even an unusually understanding one. 3-day stubble shadowed his jaw, and the dark circles under his eyes testified to late nights spent catching up on invoices after Emma went to bed. Miyuki's probably used to meeting people who have time for haircuts and dry cleaning, not mechanics who smell like motor oil and sleep deprivation. Emma appeared in the doorway already dressed in her favorite butterfly pattern shirt and holding his cleanest pair of jeans. "You promised we wouldn't be late." Jack's chest tightened with affection for his daughter, who approached this coffee meeting with the gravity of a diplomatic summit. The fact that she'd included herself in the invitation without discussion was so quintessentially Emma that he hadn't even considered leaving her behind. 20 minutes later, they pulled into the parking lot of Eastside Brewing, an independent coffee shop far from the city's financial district. Jack had suggested it, half expecting Miyuki to counter with some trendy downtown location where the baristas wore bow ties and the smallest coffee cost more than his hourly wage. But she'd agreed immediately, saying she'd been meaning to explore neighborhoods beyond her corporate bubble. Emma spotted her first waving with enough enthusiasm to attract attention from several nearby tables. Miyuki sat near a window, the morning sunlight illuminating her profile. Gone was the formal business suit from the charity dinner. Today she wore dark jeans and a simple cream sweater that somehow managed to look both casual and expensive. Her hair fell loose around her shoulders, making her appear younger, more approachable. When she turned and smiled at them, Jack felt an unexpected flutter of nervousness. Without the heightened emotions of the charity dinner, the adrenaline of public confrontation and shared vulnerability, he suddenly wondered if they would have anything to talk about. Maybe the connection he'd felt had been situational, a temporary alliance against common adversaries, rather than the beginning of something more lasting. Emma, oblivious to his hesitation, bounded forward. "We brought you something." Jack watched as his daughter proudly presented the butterfly guide they'd stopped to purchase, on the way a field identification book with detailed illustrations of Japanese species. Miyuki's expression shifted from surprise to genuine delight as she accepted the gift, running her fingers over the cover with reverence. Emma insisted Jack explain, suddenly self-conscious about the modest gift. "After you mentioned the great purple emperor—" "This is perfect," Miyuki interrupted, her voice warm with sincerity. "I haven't thought about these butterflies since I was a little girl visiting my grandmother in Kyoto." Emma climbed into the chair beside Miyuki, already flipping to find the specific butterfly they'd discussed. Jack settled across from them, oddly touched by how Miyuki angled the book, so Emma could see better, how she listened with complete focus as his daughter pointed out her favorite illustrations. It struck him that many adults merely tolerated Emma's enthusiasms, nodding politely while checking their phones or glancing around for escape routes. Miyuki engaged with her as a person worth listening to, not merely a child to be humored. The realization triggered both gratitude and an unexpected pang of something deeper, a recognition that Emma deserved more people in her life who saw her this way, who didn't treat her intelligence and curiosity as inconveniences to be managed. "I ordered for you," Miyuki said, when Emma paused for breath. "I hope that's okay. The barista said you come here often." Jack glanced toward the counter where Tomas, the owner, gave him a thumbs up. Miyuki must have asked about their preferences, a small gesture that revealed thoughtfulness beneath her reserved exterior. Their conversation flowed more easily than Jack had anticipated, moving from Emma's school projects to Jack's work at the garage to Miyuki's current business challenges. When Emma excused herself to examine the pastry case more closely, a brief, comfortable silence settled between the adults. So Miyuki began, sipping her tea. "Your Japanese is still excellent. Most people lose language skills quickly without practice." Jack smiled, memories of his years abroad surfacing unexpectedly. "I don't use it much anymore, but it was pretty thoroughly beaten into my brain. Making language mistakes at Toyota could mean the difference between a functioning car and a serious safety issue." "What brought you back to the States?" Her question was casual, but Jack heard the genuine curiosity beneath it. The weight of those final months in Japan pressed against his chest as he considered how much to share. Elizabeth got sick, pancreatic cancer. They gave her 3 months, but she held on for almost a year. When it became clear that she wasn't going to get better, we decided to come home so she could spend her remaining time with family. Miyuki's eyes softened with understanding. I remember the announcement about her illness circulating through the company, but I didn't know the details. I'm sorry. Jack nodded, surprised by how much easier it was becoming to speak about this chapter of his life. For years, he'd avoided the topic entirely, unwilling to navigate the awkward responses from people who didn't know what to say in the face of such loss. Coming back was the right decision, but afterward, everything was different. I'd been an engineer with a promising career at one of the world's leading automotive companies. Suddenly, I was a single father with a 3-year-old living with my in-laws, trying to piece together what our life would look like without Elizabeth. How did you end up as a mechanic? The question held no judgment, only genuine interest in connecting the dots between his past and present. Jack watched Emma charming Tomas into explaining how the espresso machine worked. It wasn't the plan. I applied for engineering positions, but the gap in my resume raised questions. Companies assumed I'd been fired or that my skills were outdated. I could have pushed harder, networked more, but Emma needed stability more than I needed a corner office. He rotated his coffee cup slowly, considering his next words. Rodriguez was Elizabeth's uncle. He offered me steady work at his garage while I figured things out. Temporary became permanent. Turns out I'm good with my hands, not just my head. And there's something satisfying about fixing things that are broken, about sending something back into the world better than when it came to you. Miyuki nodded slowly, her expression contemplative. Sometimes the paths we don't choose end up being exactly where we need to be. A week ago, Jack might have heard these words as empty platitudes from someone who'd never experienced genuine hardship. Now he recognized them as the reflection of Miyuki's own experience navigating between identities and expectations. What about you? He asked, genuinely curious about the journey that had led her from a cultural consultant working with foreign engineers to the CEO of a multinational technology company. Miyuki's smile held a trace of self-deprecation. The condensed version: I was in the right place at the right time with the right idea. The longer version involves a lot of 60-hour weeks, some strategic risks that paid off, and learning to navigate rooms where nobody expected me to have a seat at the table. Jack recognized the deliberate lightness in her tone, the same way he sometimes downplayed his own struggles when talking to others. It occurred to him that they shared this tendency to minimize their challenges rather than risk being perceived as seeking pity or special consideration. The conversation might have continued in this vein indefinitely, two adults cautiously circling deeper waters, if not for Emma's return with a chocolate croissant and a direct question that sliced through social niceties with the precision of a surgical instrument. Are you and my dad going to be friends now? Because I think you should. He doesn't have many, and you look happier when you're talking to him than you did at that fancy dinner. Jack nearly choked on his coffee. Emma Miyuki's startled laugh dispersed the momentary embarrassment. I would like that very much, Emma, if your dad is willing to put up with someone whose social calendar is a nightmare. The simple sincerity of her response disarmed him. It wasn't the polite deflection he'd expected, but something more genuine, an acknowledgement that friendship required effort and intention, especially between adults whose lives operated in different orbits. I think we can manage that, he replied, surprising himself with how much he meant it. Emma, satisfied with this exchange, turned to Miyuki with renewed purpose. So when can we see the butterflies? You said there were Japanese ones at the botanical garden. Jack opened his mouth to rein in his daughter's presumption, but Miyuki was already consulting her phone calendar. The spring exhibition opens next weekend. Saturday morning would work for me if you are free. The tentative question held more than a simple scheduling inquiry. It was an offering a specific time carved out of what Jack imagined must be an impossibly demanding schedule, a deliberate choice to prioritize this new connection over countless other obligations. We're free, Emma answered before Jack could speak, her confidence in planning their social calendar absolute. Dad never works Saturdays unless it's an emergency, and my soccer practice isn't until afternoon. Miyuki glanced at Jack, a silent question in her eyes. He nodded, finding himself unexpectedly eager to extend their time together beyond this coffee shop meeting. Saturday sounds perfect. As they parted ways in the parking lot, Jack felt a curious lightness he hadn't experienced in years, the sensation of something new beginning, of horizons expanding rather than contracting. Emma skipped ahead to their truck, already planning what she would wear to the botanical gardens and which butterfly questions she would ask. Jack turned to Miyuki, suddenly awkward again without Emma as a buffer between them. Thanks for this, for making time. I know you must have 1,000 more important things to do. Miyuki's gaze held his for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. You know what I've learned after 15 years in business, Jack? The important things are not always the ones on your calendar. Sometimes they're the conversations you didn't know you needed to have. The week that followed brought unexpected developments. Rodriguez's nephew, who'd been threatening for years to join the family business, finally made good on his promise, arriving from Texas with mechanical certifications and a willingness to take on evening shifts. For the first time since Jack had started working at the garage, he found himself with regular hours and predictable free time. Miyuki's company announced a major partnership with an educational technology provider, a development that made the local business news and led to a flurry of interview requests. Jack read about it online during his lunch break, unexpectedly proud of her success, despite having no claim to it beyond their nascent friendship. Emma, meanwhile, had become obsessed with Japanese culture, checking out library books and pestering Jack with questions about his time abroad that required him to dust off memories he'd carefully packed away. Her bedroom walls, once covered exclusively with butterfly illustrations, has now featured printouts of Mount Fuji and Japanese garden designs alongside her lepidopteran interests. On Friday evening, while helping Emma select which butterfly identification cards to bring to the botanical gardens, Jack's phone chimed with a text message from Miyuki. Emergency board meeting tomorrow morning. Can't reschedule. So sorry to disappoint Emma. Rain check. Jack felt a disproportionate wave of disappointment followed immediately by self-reproach for expecting someone like Miyuki to prioritize a casual outing with them over her professional responsibilities. He showed the message to Emma, bracing himself for tears or accusations. Instead, his daughter's face scrunched in thought. Can we bring her dinner? When Mom was working late, we always brought her dinner at the hospital. You said it made her happy. Jack stared at Emma, blindsided by the casual reference to a memory he hadn't known she possessed. Elizabeth had worked as a pediatric nurse before her illness, often pulling double shifts during staffing shortages. He and toddler Emma had indeed shown up with takeout containers on numerous occasions, turning the sterile hospital break room into an impromptu family dinner. He hadn't realized Emma remembered these moments. The realization that she carried such specific memories of her mother, memories that weren't prompted by photographs or stories he'd told, left him momentarily speechless. Dad, you always say food fixes everything. Jack recovered his voice, though his throat felt unexpectedly tight. I don't know if Miyuki would want us showing up at her office, kiddo. Important meetings usually mean private business discussions. Emma considered this objection with the gravity of a Supreme Court justice weighing constitutional precedent. We could ask her. The worst she can say is no. Her logical approach cut through his hesitation. He typed out a message, keeping his tone light, to give Miyuki an easy out if the suggestion made her uncomfortable. Emma suggests we bring dinner to you tomorrow after your meeting. Her theory is that food fixes everything. No pressure, we understand if you need to focus on work. Miyuki's response came faster than he expected. That would be wonderful. Meeting should end by 6, security desk and lobby. I'll leave your names. Followed immediately by another message. Nobody's brought me dinner at the office before. Your daughter might be onto something. The Global Bridge Technologies headquarters occupied 15 floors of a gleaming downtown tower, its glass exterior reflecting the sunset in shades of amber and gold, as Jack and Emma approached the following evening. Emma insisted on carrying the bag from Miyuki's favorite sushi restaurant information, extracted from Miyuki's assistant, through Emma's remarkably persuasive phone manner, while Jack managed the drink carrier with hot tea. The security guard examined their IDs with bored efficiency before directing them to the executive elevator. Jack felt increasingly out of place as they ascended to the top floor, acutely aware of his worn jeans and the lingering scent of motor oil that never completely left his skin, despite thorough scrubbing. Emma, by contrast, carried herself with the confidence of someone who belonged everywhere she went. The elevator opened directly into a reception area where a tired-looking young man brightened at their appearance. You must be Emma and Jack. Ms. Tanaka just wrapped up. Let me tell her you're here. Before he could reach for his phone, Miyuki emerged from a conference room deep in conversation with 2 men in expensive suits. Her professional armor was fully deployed, tailored blazer hair pulled back in a sleek nod expression, serious as she addressed what appeared to be lingering concerns about whatever had been discussed in their meeting. When she spotted them, however, her entire demeanor transformed. The corporate mask fell away, replaced by genuine warmth that momentarily stunned the men beside her, who exchanged surprised glances at this unexpected version of their CEO. Emma marched forward with their offering. "We brought dinner because your meeting probably made you hungry, and food fixes everything." The men looked perplexed by this small girl, confidently addressing their CEO, but Miyuki accepted the bag with the solemnity the gesture deserved. "You have perfect timing. I was just telling these gentlemen that we need to conclude for the evening." The dismissal was polite but firm. The men nodded, making their farewells with curious glances at Jack, clearly trying to place him in their mental organizational chart of people with access to Miyuki Tanaka after hours. Once they departed, Miyuki's shoulders visibly relaxed. "You have no idea how much I need this right now. Come on, let's eat in my office where we won't be interrupted." Her private office occupied a corner with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. Unlike the sterile minimalist executive suites Jack had imagined, Miyuki's space contained unexpected touches of personality. A collection of small ceramic animals on her bookshelf framed photographs of mountain landscapes, and a worn leather armchair that looked significantly more comfortable than her desk chair. Emma immediately gravitated to the window view, pressing her nose against the glass to observe the city spread below them like a carpet of lights. "My classroom would fit in here 10 times. Miyuki smiled as she cleared space on a small conference table. "This is more space than I need, honestly. But apparently CEOs require square footage proportional to their importance." Corporate theater. The casual critique of executive excess surprised Jack. Most successful people he'd encountered seemed to take such privileges for granted, assuming they'd earned every perk through merit alone. They settled around the table, Miyuki groaning with appreciation at the selection of sushi Emma had insisted upon. "How did you know this is my favorite?" Emma beamed with pride. "I called and asked your assistant. She was very helpful once I explained it was an emergency food mission." Jack nearly choked on his tea. "You did what when while you were fixing Mrs. Peterson's brakes. I used your phone." Miyuki's laughter dispelled his momentary mortification. "Your daughter has excellent reconnaissance skills. Future CIA material." As they ate, Miyuki gradually shared details about the emergency meeting, a potential security vulnerability in their flagship product that required immediate attention and a public statement. Jack listened, impressed by her straightforward explanation of complex technical issues without condescension or oversimplification. "Sorry about the botanical garden," Emma interrupted, bringing the conversation back to what she clearly considered the more important matter. Miyuki set down her chopsticks, giving Emma her full attention. "I'm sorry too. I was really looking forward to it. We could go next week instead," Emma offered magnanimously. "The butterflies will still be there." "Next Saturday," Miyuki asked, glancing at Jack for confirmation. "I'll block the entire morning. No emergency meetings allowed." The ease with which she rearranged her schedule for them created an odd pressure in Jack's chest, a mixture of gratitude and lingering disbelief that someone in her position would prioritize time with them over the countless demands of her position. After dinner, Emma discovered Miyuki's collection of ceramic animals, each representing a different Japanese zodiac sign. Miyuki joined her on the floor, explaining the significance of each figure and the personality traits associated with them. Jack watched their interaction from the leather armchair, struck by how naturally they communicated, despite the vast differences in their life experiences. When Emma drifted into an impromptu nap on the office sofa, exhausted from the excitement of their urban adventure, Jack and Miyuki moved to the window, speaking more softly. "Thanks for letting us crash your Friday night," Jack said, suddenly conscious of how presumptuous their dinner delivery might have seemed. Emma can be pretty determined once she gets an idea in her head. Miyuki leaned against the window frame, the city lights illuminating her profile. Today was brutal. 12 hours of crisis management, explaining technical vulnerabilities to non-technical board members, crafting statements that won't tank our stock price on Monday. This you and Emma showing up with food and normal conversation is exactly what I needed. The simple honesty of her statement created a bridge between their seemingly disparate lives. Jack recognized in her exhaustion the same bone-deep fatigue he felt after days of crawling under vehicles and managing difficult customers. Different causes, but the same human need for connection and moments of respite. "How do you do it?" he asked. "Balance all of this, the responsibility, the pressure." Miyuki considered the question, her gaze fixed on the city below. Most days I'm not sure that I do. There's a Japanese concept called Gaimon, enduring the seemingly unbearable with patience and dignity. I thought coming to America meant leaving those cultural pressures behind, but I've just transferred them to different expectations. She turned to face him, her expression more vulnerable than he'd seen since the charity dinner. The truth is, Jack, most nights I go home to an empty penthouse where every detail has been arranged by my personal assistant. I eat perfectly prepared meals, I review reports until midnight, and I start again at 5 the next morning. It's a beautiful empty life. The admission hung between them, weightier than casual Friday conversation typically allowed. Jack recognized the courage it took to voice such loneliness, especially for someone who'd built such formidable professional walls. I know something about beautiful empty spaces, he replied quietly. After Elizabeth died, I kept our house perfect for months. Dishes always washed, laundry always folded, everything in its place, as if maintaining order could somehow fill the void she left behind. They stood in companionable silence, two people who understood loss in different but compatible ways. Jack glanced at Emma peacefully, asleep on the office sofa, and felt a rush of gratitude for his daughter's simple wisdom in suggesting this dinner. The weeks that followed established a rhythm to their evolving friendship. Saturday at the Botanical Gardens extended to Sunday lunch at a ramen shop Emma had researched extensively online. Miyuki joined them for Emma's soccer game the following weekend, cheering with unexpected enthusiasm when Emma scored her first ever goal. Jack found himself looking forward to their meetings with an intensity that occasionally alarmed him. After years of narrowing his world to work and Emma's needs, the expansion of his social circle, even by just one person, felt simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying. On a rainy Thursday evening while Emma was at her friend's house for dinner, Miyuki called rather than texted, her voice tense with controlled excitement. "Jack, I need a second opinion on something. Can you meet me downtown in an hour?" The urgency in her tone triggered immediate concern. "What's wrong? Are you okay?" "Yes, sorry, nothing's wrong. It's a good thing, potentially. I trust your perspective. Bring a decent jacket. Somewhere not too casual, but not a suit." An hour later, Jack found himself standing beside Miyuki outside an unassuming brick building in a rapidly gentrifying industrial district. He'd managed to borrow a sports coat from Rodriguez and paired it with his least worn jeans, feeling oddly nervous about whatever mysterious evaluation Miyuki had summoned him for. "What exactly are we doing here?" Jack asked as Miyuki punched a code into a keypad beside an unmarked door. She hesitated, uncharacteristically uncertain. "I'm considering buying this building, as an investment but also for a specific project. I wanted your opinion before I make a final decision." The door opened into a vast open space, clearly once a manufacturing floor, now stripped to its architectural bones. Exposed brick walls framed massive windows that would flood the space with light in better weather. The wooden ceiling beams had been restored to their original glory, and the concrete floors gleamed with recent polishing. Miyuki watched his face as he absorbed the space. "You have a good eye for structural integrity." "What do you see?" Jack walked the perimeter, slowly examining load-bearing columns and inspecting the condition of the windows. Years of assessing vehicles for hidden problems had trained him to look beyond cosmetic features to the fundamental soundness of what lay beneath. "It's beautiful," he concluded. "Solid construction, thoughtful renovation, work. Whoever stripped it back to the original elements knew what they were doing. What are you planning to use it for?" Miyuki took a deep breath as if preparing to reveal something deeply personal. "An educational center. A place where kids from different backgrounds can learn language skills, but also cultural competency. Where they can understand that diversity isn't just a buzzword, but a practical advantage in solving problems. Like a community center, but focused on global citizenship." She spoke faster as she outlined her vision, her usual corporate reserve falling away. "We'd have exchange students as mentors, immersive language environments, cultural events open to the public. Technology would be part of it, our translation software and virtual reality environments. But the core would be human connection, real relationships across cultural boundaries." Jack listened, struck by the passion in her voice and the clarity of her vision. "It's the foundation for your corporate work, starting with kids instead of businesses." Exactly. Miyuki's face lit with pleasure at his understanding. "Business solutions are necessary, but they're reactive. This would be proactive, building bridges before the chasms between cultures become too wide to cross." She hesitated, her enthusiasm giving way to a more vulnerable question. Do you think it would work? Or is it just a CEO's vanity project, throwing money at a problem too complex for any single solution? The question revealed the doubt beneath her confident exterior, the same uncertainty Jack felt whenever he made decisions that would shape Emma's future. He considered his answer carefully, knowing she hadn't brought him here for empty reassurance. I think it's ambitious, he began slowly. Maybe even idealistic. But idealism backed by practical experience and genuine commitment isn't naive. It's how meaningful change happens. He gestured toward the space around them. This could become something extraordinary. Not because the building is impressive or because technology is flashy, but because you understand both sides of the cultural equation. You've lived in the gap between worlds. You know what it costs and what it's worth. Miyuki's expression softened, relief evident in the relaxation of her shoulders. That's exactly why I wanted your opinion. You've navigated more cultural transitions than most people realize. Military to civilian American, to Japanese workplace engineer, to mechanic, husband, to single parent. You understand adaptation isn't just about language, it's about recalibrating your entire identity. The insight was so precise, so attuned to his experience, that Jack felt momentarily transparent, as if Miyuki could see layers of his life he rarely acknowledged even to himself. The recognition created an unexpected intimacy between them. Standing in this empty building filled with potential, two people who recognized in each other the capacity to rebuild, to transform spaces both physical and personal. So you'll do it. Help me with this. Miyuki asked her question, tentative despite her usual decisiveness. I need someone who understands both technical specifications and human needs. Someone who can see structural problems before they become critical failures. The invitation caught him off guard. You want me involved in this project? I'm a mechanic, Miyuki, not an architectural consultant or an education expert. She shook her head, dismissing his objection. You're an engineer who understands cultural translation from personal experience. You solve complex mechanical problems by diagnosing root causes, not just symptoms. And you're raising a daughter who naturally builds bridges between people, a skill she clearly learned from watching you. Jack felt an uncomfortable mix of pride and imposter syndrome at her assessment. You make me sound more impressive than I am. Miyuki's gaze was steady, challenging. Or maybe you've forgotten parts of yourself that I can still see clearly. The statement hung between them, fraught with implications beyond the immediate conversation. Rain drummed against the massive windows as they stood facing each other in the empty space, a space that, like their evolving relationship, hummed with potential energy and unanswered questions. The moment might have extended indefinitely if not for the buzz of Jack's phone, Emma texting that she was ready to be picked up from her friend's house. The interruption broke the tension, returning them to the practical realities that shaped their separate lives. I need to get Emma, Jack said, both relieved and disappointed by the necessary departure. Miyuki nodded, her professional composure settling back into place as they walked toward the exit. Think about it, though, the project. Your involvement. No pressure, but I'll think about it, he promised, knowing he would likely think of little else in the days to come. As they parted ways on the rain-slicked sidewalk, Jack was struck by a disorienting sense that his carefully constrained life was expanding beyond his control, that Miyuki Tanaka had somehow found cracks in the protective walls he'd built around himself, and Emma allowing possibilities he'd long ago abandoned to seep back into their existence. The following week brought unexpected complications. Rodriguez suffered a minor heart attack, leaving Jack to manage the garage operations while simultaneously coordinating with hospital staff and worried family members. Emma developed a persistent cough that required a pediatrician visit and several nights of disrupted sleep. Miyuki flew to San Francisco for back-to-back investor meetings related to funding for her educational center project. Their communication shifted to late-night text messages and brief phone calls snatched during rare moments of calm. Despite the physical distance, Jack found these digital connections became anchoring points in the chaos of his days. Miyuki's voice on the phone offering both practical suggestions for managing Rodriguez's business affairs and the simple comfort of being fully understood in his challenges. When Emma's cough worsened despite medication, Jack found himself calling Miyuki at midnight, desperate for another adult's perspective on whether an emergency room visit was warranted. She answered immediately despite the 3-hour time difference on the West Coast. Listening to Emma's breathing over the phone, and sharing her own childhood experiences with similar respiratory issues. Go to Children's Hospital on Willow Street, she advised with calm authority. Ask for Dr. Patel in pediatric respiratory. Tell them I sent you. I'll make a call to ensure they're expecting you. Jack wanted to protest the special treatment, the pulling of strings he hadn't asked for, but Emma's labored breathing overrode his pride. Thank you, I didn't know who else to call. Miyuki's voice softened. That's what friends are for, Jack. Especially at midnight when you're scared for your child. At the hospital, Jack was startled by the immediate attention they received, whisked past the crowded waiting room to a private examination area where Dr. Patel, a kind-eyed woman in her 50s, was indeed waiting for them. As she examined Emma with gentle efficiency, Jack wondered about the extent of Miyuki's influence and the networks of connections she could access with a single phone call. Emma was diagnosed with acute bronchitis requiring breathing treatments, but no hospitalization. As they waited for her prescription to be filled at the 24-hour pharmacy, Jack's phone buzzed with a text from Miyuki. How is she? Do you need anything? The simple message unleashed an unexpected wave of emotion. For years, Jack had handled every crisis alone, making decisions without a partner to consult, bearing the full weight of responsibility for Emma's well-being. The realization that someone else, someone who had no obligation to them, was actively concerned about their welfare hit him with the force of a physical blow. She'll be okay. Thank you for the help. We wouldn't have seen a doctor so quickly without your call. Miyuki's response came immediately. That's how it should be, Jack. No one should face emergencies alone. The message echoed in his mind as he drove a finally sleeping Emma home in the pre-dawn darkness. No one should face emergencies alone. For the first time since Elizabeth's death, he allowed himself to consider what it might mean to have a true partner to kin, someone to share not just the joys, but the terrifying responsibility of ensuring another human's welfare. The thought both attracted and terrified him. By the time Miyuki returned from San Francisco, Rodriguez was back home on restricted activity, and Emma had recovered enough to return to school. The three of them met for dinner at a small Italian restaurant, Emma monopolizing the conversation with elaborate accounts of her hospitalization, significantly dramatized from the 4-hour emergency room visit, and detailed descriptions of how the breathing treatments had felt like a dragon blowing smoke into my mouth. Miyuki listened with appropriate amazement, asking questions that indicated genuine interest rather than polite attention. Jack watched their interaction, still processing the evolution of this unexpected relationship and its growing importance in both their lives. When Emma excused herself to examine the restaurant's fish tank, Miyuki turned to Jack with a more serious expression. I secured the initial funding for the education center. We close on the building next week. Congratulations, he replied, genuinely pleased for her success but uncertain what it meant for his potential involvement. Have you thought more about how you want to set it up? Miyuki hesitated, uncharacteristically uncertain. Actually, I've been thinking about your role. I don't just want your input on the building renovation, Jack. I want to offer you a position, Director of Technical Integration, overseeing how we implement technology in culturally appropriate ways, ensuring our engineering solutions actually serve human needs rather than just looking impressive. Jack stared at her, certain he'd misunderstood. You're offering me a job. I fix cars, Miyuki. I haven't worked in tech for nearly a decade. She leaned forward, intensity radiating from her expression. You're an engineer who understands cross-cultural communication from personal experience. You can translate between technical requirements and human needs better than anyone I've ever met. The car repair, that's just where life took you, not the sum of what you're capable of. Her assessment both flattered and unsettled him. The idea that she saw capacities in him that he'd buried beneath years of pragmatic compromise was simultaneously exhilarating and threatening to the careful equilibrium he'd established in his reduced expectations. What would this mean for Emma? For our life, he asked, the practical concerns of a single parent immediately surfacing. Miyuki had clearly anticipated this question. The position would have flexible hours. You could set your own schedule around Emma's needs. The salary would be significant enough that you'd have options for quality childcare when necessary. And the education center will have after-school programs she could participate in. She paused, studying his expression. This isn't charity, Jack. I'm not offering you this because we're friends. I'm offering because you're exactly what this project needs, someone who understands both the technical and human elements of cultural integration. Jack felt suspended between two potential futures, continuing the safe, predictable life he'd constructed after Elizabeth's death, or stepping into an unknown path that promised both greater challenges and rewards. The decision wasn't just professional, but deeply personal, affecting not only his own identity, but Emma's developing sense of possibility. "I need time to think about this," he finally replied. "It's not just about the ball. It's about what kind of life I want for Emma, for both of us." Miyuki nodded acceptance in her expression. "Take all the time you need. The opportunity isn't going anywhere." Emma returned from the fish tank, immediately sensing the charged atmosphere between the adults. "Did you tell him about the mom?" she asked Miyuki with the directness that continually startled both of them. Jack's surprise must have shown on his face because Miyuki immediately looked guilty. "Emma may have overheard me practicing my job offer speech on the phone with my assistant, and she may have provided some feedback on how to convince you." Emma climbed back into her chair, her expression serious beyond her years. "Dad, you should take the job. You always tell me to try new things even when they're scary. And you look happier when you're talking about buildings and technology than when you come home smelling like car engines." The simple observation struck Jack with unexpected force, the recognition that his daughter saw through his careful contentment to the lingering hunger for challenges beyond the garage. He'd thought he'd hidden his occasional restlessness, his moments of wondering about roads not taken, but children absorbed far more than adults realized. "I just want you to be happy, Dad. And Miyuki makes you smile more than anyone except me." The innocent statement hung in the air between the adults, carrying implications Emma couldn't possibly understand. Jack felt heat creeping up his neck as Miyuki suddenly became very interested in her water glass, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. Their eyes met briefly over Emma's head, a moment of shared recognition that their developing relationship had dimensions beyond professional collaboration or casual friendship. Neither was ready to name these possibilities aloud, but their existence hummed beneath the surface of every interaction, creating both excitement and apprehension about the path ahead. As they walked to their cars after dinner, Emma skipping ahead to examine a shop window display, Miyuki touched Jack's arm lightly. "Whatever you decide about the job, it won't change anything between us. I value our friendship too much to let professional decisions affect that." The statement was clearly meant to relieve pressure to create space for his decision without emotional complications. But Jack found himself wondering if the neat separation she proposed between their personal connection and professional relationship was either possible or desirable. "What if I want things to change?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. The words emerged before he could analyze them, before he could weigh their implications or consider their consequences. Miyuki's steps faltered slightly, her composed expression giving way to momentary vulnerability. "How would you want them to change?" The question hung between them as Emma raced back to show them a butterfly ornament in the shop window, her excitement creating a necessary pause in their conversation. Jack felt simultaneously relieved by and resentful of the interruption, uncertain whether he was ready to articulate the growing recognition that Miyuki Tanaka had become essential to his sense of possibility, not just professionally, but personally. As they said their goodbyes in the parking lot, the unfinished conversation created a tangible current between them. Miyuki hesitated before getting into her car, turning back to Jack with an expression of careful determination. "There's a Japanese concept called koi no yokan," she said quietly. "It's different from love at first sight. It means the feeling upon meeting someone that falling in love with them is inevitable, that your paths are meant to converge even if the journey takes time." She didn't wait for his response, sliding into her car with the grace that characterized all her movements. As Jack watched her drive away, Emma's small hand found his squeezing with intuitive understanding of her father's turbulent emotions. "I think she likes us, Dad. Like really likes us." Jack looked down at his daughter, this remarkably perceptive child who had somehow become his compass in navigating emotional terrain he'd long avoided. "Yeah, kiddo, I think she does. And we like her too, right? Like really like her." The simple question cut through his adult complications, reducing complex emotions to their essential truth. "Yeah, Emma, we really do." As they drove home through the night-darkened streets, Jack felt himself standing at a crossroads, not just professionally, but personally. Ahead lay uncharted territory, a landscape of possibilities he'd stopped allowing himself to imagine after Elizabeth's death. The path forward wasn't clear, but for the first time in years, he felt truly awake to the potential of his own life, to the prospect that loss might not be the end of his story, but merely a chapter in a longer narrative still unfolding. Emma fell asleep in the back seat, her breathing deep and even, recovered from the illness that had momentarily terrified him. Jack glanced at her in the rearview mirror, thinking about her simple wisdom. You should try new things even when they're scary. Perhaps it was time to follow his daughter's advice to step beyond the boundaries of the life he'd carefully constructed and risk the messy, unpredictable joy of new beginnings. The thought was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating, like standing at the edge of a precipice and finally choosing to leap uncertain of the landing, but unwilling to remain forever on solid, unchanging ground. Jack stared at the job offer letters on his kitchen table, the crisp corporate letterhead of Global Bridge Technologies, at odds with the well-worn surface marked by Emma's art projects and years of family meals. The salary figure made him blink twice, nearly triple what he earned at Rodriguez's garage. Benefits included comprehensive health insurance, retirement matching flexible hours, and even a college savings plan contribution for Emma. He ran his fingers over Miyuki's signature at the bottom, the elegant strokes reflecting her precise nature. 2 weeks had passed since their dinner conversation, 2 weeks of careful consideration and late-night pros and cons lists. 2 weeks of Emma casually mentioning how cool it would be if Dad worked in that awesome building with Miyuki. Rodriguez had recovered enough to return to limited duties at the garage. When Jack had hesitantly broached the subject of the job offer, the older man had laughed and clapped him on the shoulder. You think I didn't see this coming? The minute you started talking about that CEO lady, I knew you wouldn't be fixing transmissions forever. You were meant for more than this place, mijo. Always were. The simple validation from his father-in-law had loosened something in Jack's chest, permission he hadn't realized he needed to consider a future beyond the carefully constructed boundaries he'd established after Elizabeth's death. His phone buzzed with a text from Miyuki. No pressure, just checking in. How are you? They'd maintained their friendship throughout his decision-making process, though a new awareness hummed beneath their interactions, the unfinished conversation from the restaurant parking lot, the acknowledgement of feelings neither had fully articulated. Jack had sensed Miyuki deliberately creating space, careful not to influence his professional decision with personal complications. Before he could respond, Emma burst through the front door, backpack slung over one shoulder, clutching a paper with obvious excitement. Dad, my science project got picked for the district competition. Ms. Chen says my butterfly migration tracking system is the most innovative in the whole school. She thrust the acceptance letter into his hands, her entire body vibrating with pride. Jack examined the paper, genuinely impressed by the achievement. That's incredible, Emma. I always knew you were a genius, but now everyone else gets to see it too. Emma's grin faltered slightly. The competition's in 3 weeks. There's just one problem. I need better equipment to make my tracking tags smaller. And someone who knows about coding to help me finish the software part. Jack's mind immediately jumped to Miyuki, whose company specialized in exactly the kind of technology Emma's project required. For weeks, he'd been carefully compartmentalizing, keeping his relationship with Miyuki separate from major life decisions, trying to ensure his choice came from rational evaluation rather than emotional impulse. But watching his daughter's brilliant idea, stalled by resource limitations, crystallized something he'd been circling for days. Maybe it's time we both had access to better resources, he said, making his decision in that moment. How would you feel if I took that job with Miyuki's company? Emma's eyes widened. Her reaction wasn't the simple enthusiasm he'd expected, but something more complex, a child confronting the potential reality of a change she'd advocated for, but hadn't fully processed. Would we have to move? Would I switch schools? What about Mr. Rodriguez? The practical questions revealed the roots of stability Jack had managed to create despite their challenges, routines, and connections Emma had come to rely on. He pulled her close, suddenly aware of how carefully he needed to navigate this transition. We wouldn't move right away. I'd start the job, see how it goes, how the schedule works with your school. Mr. Rodriguez is doing better, and he's got his nephew helping now. Nothing has to change overnight. Emma considered this with the seriousness she brought to all significant decisions. Then we should do it. You always tell me to be brave when opportunities come. This is your butterfly migration, Dad. The phrase caught him off guard, this unexpected metaphor from his science-minded daughter. He wondered how much of Miyuki's influence had already seeped into their lives, this way of framing change, not as something to fear, but as a natural progression, a necessary journey towards something new. Jack texted Miyuki that evening after Emma went to bed. "I'd like to accept the position, and Emma needs some help with a science project involving butterfly tracking technology. Two birds, one stone." Her response came immediately. "Wonderful news on both counts. When can you start? The butterfly expert is particularly welcome. We have resources she might find useful." The following Monday, Jack submitted his official notice to Rodriguez, who responded with a mixture of sadness and pride. That evening, he and Emma visited Global Bridge Technologies headquarters, not as dinner delivery service this time, but as prospective employee and budding scientist. Miyuki had arranged for Emma to meet with the company's research and development team, who treated her butterfly tracking concept with the seriousness typically reserved for major corporate initiatives. Jack watched from the sidelines as his daughter explained her hypothesis to a group of engineers and computer scientists, her initial nervousness giving way to animated discussion of miniaturized tracking devices and software modifications. While Emma was thoroughly occupied, Miyuki gave Jack a proper tour of the company, not just the executive floor he'd seen previously, but the various departments that would intersect with his new role. The technical integration team he would lead consisted of engineers from diverse backgrounds, each specializing in adapting technology for different cultural contexts. "This group will be your direct reports," Miyuki explained, as they observed a team working on a project involving gesture recognition across cultural differences. "They're brilliant technically, but they need someone who understands both the engineering challenges and the human factors. Someone who can translate between technological capacity and actual human needs." Jack felt a flutter of apprehension as he surveyed the sophisticated equipment and advanced degrees evident in the workspace. "I haven't led a technical team in years. What if my skills aren't current enough?" Miyuki's expression grew serious. "Technical specifications change constantly. What doesn't change is the ability to see the problem beneath the problem, to recognize when a solution addresses symptoms rather than causes. That's what made you exceptional in Japan, and it's what we need here." Her confidence eased his anxiety, though he still wondered if she was overestimating his abilities based on memories of who he'd been a decade earlier. They ended the tour at the construction site of the educational center, the brick building now humming with renovation activity. Workers were installing massive glass panels in previously bricked-over windows, opening the space to natural light while preserving its industrial character. As they walked through areas marked by tape on the floor to indicate future classrooms and gathering spaces, Miyuki shared her evolving vision for the center, a place where technology would enhance rather than replace human connection, where cultural differences would be treated as resources rather than obstacles. Watching her animated descriptions of future possibilities, Jack was struck by the parallels in their journeys. Both had experienced profound loss, his through Elizabeth's death, hers through cultural displacement and professional isolation. Both had responded by narrowing their focus, channeling their energies into clearly defined responsibilities. And both were now tentatively expanding, again taking risks on new possibilities. The construction foreman interrupted their conversation with urgent questions about electrical specifications, drawing Miyuki into a technical discussion. Jack wandered toward the building's eastern wall where temporary plastic sheeting covered a partially completed section. Pulling back the plastic, he discovered a courtyard space being transformed into what appeared to be a Japanese garden, complete with stone pathways and carefully positioned rocks awaiting surrounding vegetation. When Miyuki joined him moments later, her expression revealed both pride and vulnerability. "This will be the heart of the center," she explained, "a place of contemplation and connection, traditional Japanese design principles adapted for American urban space." What do you think? The question carried weight beyond aesthetic assessment, a testing of whether he truly understood the cultural translation she was attempting, the bridge building at the core of her vision. Jack considered the space thoughtfully. "It creates a center of stillness without stopping movement, entirely pathways that slow you down without forcing you to halt completely. Very different from American garden design, which is usually about destination points rather than the journey between them." Miyuki's smile confirmed he'd grasped the essential concept. "Exactly. We're not asking people to become Japanese in their thinking, just to experience a different way of moving through space, of relating to their environment. Small shifts in perspective that accumulate over time." The conversation might have continued in this philosophical vein if Emma hadn't appeared at the doorway flanked by two engineers who appeared slightly dazed by her enthusiasm. She's going to revolutionize butterfly migration tracking, one of them informed Jack with amused respect. We've agreed to help manufacture prototype tags using our microsensor technology. If they work as projected, there might be patent potential here. Emma bounded toward them, clutching design sketches and component lists. Dad, they have everything we need, and they said I can come back every week to work on the project. This is way better than our kitchen table lab. Jack noticed how Miyuki watched this interaction, not with the detached amusement of an executive humoring an employee's child, but with genuine investment in Emma's excitement. There was something in her expression that reminded him of Elizabeth, the same recognition of Emma's unique mind, the same commitment to nurturing her potential, rather than merely accommodating it. The realization created an unexpected ache in his chest, not the sharp pain of grief that had characterized his early loss, but a more complex emotion. Gratitude intermingled with wistfulness, appreciation for this new connection that somehow honored rather than replaced what had come before. On their drive home, Emma chattered about microprocessors and tracking algorithms, her mind racing ahead to the expanded possibilities for her project. Jack half listened, his thoughts oscillating between practical concerns about his career transition and deeper questions about the personal transformations unfolding alongside professional changes. As they stopped at a traffic light, Emma fell suddenly silent, her expression growing serious. Dad, are you and Miyuki just friends, or is it more than that? The direct question caught him off guard, though he'd sensed it forming for weeks in his observant daughter's mind. Why do you ask? Emma twisted her seatbelt between her fingers. Because you look at her the way you look in the photos with Mom. Not exactly the same, but similar. And she looks at you when you're not watching, like she's trying to figure something out. Something important. Jack felt a tightening in his throat at the comparison. The insight revealed how carefully Emma had been observing not just their interactions with Miyuki, but his relationship with Elizabeth's memory, how she was constructing her understanding of adult relationships from these scattered pieces. I care about Miyuki very much, he admitted carefully, and I think she cares about us too. But adult relationships are complicated, Em. We're still figuring it out. Emma considered this with characteristic thoughtfulness. Mom would want you to be happy, you know. She told me that before she went to heaven. She made me promise to make sure you smiled at least once every day. The revelation staggered him, this final instruction from Elizabeth to their daughter, this burden of joy Emma had been quietly carrying for 5 years. All those mornings when she'd made ridiculous faces over breakfast, the elaborate jokes she'd insisted on telling him after particularly difficult days at the garage, what he'd interpreted as natural childish silliness had been at least partly a daughter keeping a solemn promise to her dying mother. You've done a good job with that promise, Emma. He managed, his voice thick with emotion. The best job anyone could possibly do. She nodded solemnly. So maybe now Miyuki can help with that job too. It's a lot of responsibility for just one kid. The simple statement held such profound understanding of the weight of loss, of the effort required to rebuild a life from its fragments. Jack reached across the console to squeeze his daughter's hand, this remarkable child who had somehow become both his greatest responsibility and his wisest teacher. Jack's first weeks at Global Bridge Technologies unfolded in a whirlwind of new routines and responsibilities. The technical integration team he now led required a different management approach than the mechanical problems he'd solved at Rodriguez's garage. Instead of engines and transmissions with predictable failure points, he navigated interpersonal dynamics and competing priorities, translating between technical possibilities and human needs just as Miyuki had envisioned. The team's initial skepticism, particularly from those with advanced degrees and specialized expertise, gradually transformed as they recognized Jack's ability to identify core issues beneath superficial technical challenges. His years navigating cultural differences in Japan, combined with the pragmatic problem-solving of automotive repair, gave him a unique perspective that earned their reluctant respect. Meanwhile, Emma thrived with access to Global Bridge's resources for her science project. She spent Tuesday and Thursday afternoons in the company's research lab, collaborating with engineers who had begun treating her as a genuine colleague rather than a child to be humored. Her butterfly tracking system evolved into a sophisticated monitoring solution with potential applications beyond her original concept. Rodriguez's recovery progressed steadily, his nephew assuming more responsibility at the garage. Jack still spent Saturday mornings helping with complex mechanical issues, maintaining his connection to the work that had sustained them through difficult years, while gradually transitioning his primary identity from mechanic to engineer once again. Miyuki maintained professional boundaries at work, treating Jack as a valued team member, rather than emphasizing their personal connection. But their after-hours relationship continued to deepen through dinners, weekend outings, and increasingly honest conversations about their respective journeys through loss and rebuilding. 6 weeks into this new arrangement, an unexpected complication arose. Global Bridge's board of directors scheduled an emergency meeting to address concerns about the Educational Center project's budget and timeline. As Jack arrived that morning, he found Miyuki in her office, surrounded by financial projections and construction updates, her usual composed demeanor showing rare cracks of stress. "The board thinks we're overextended," she explained as he closed the door. "The Education Center, the new software release, and the expansion into European markets. They're concerned we're trying to move in too many directions simultaneously. They're pushing to prioritize commercial products and delay the center." Jack studied the projections spread across her desk. From a strictly financial perspective, the board's concern made sense. The Educational Center represented significant investment with delayed and indirect returns. But he'd seen firsthand how central this project was to Miyuki's vision for the company's long-term impact. "What happens if you push back?" he asked. Miyuki rubbed her temples, a rare display of physical fatigue. "I've built enough corporate capital to insist on moving forward, but at a cost. Some board members have been waiting for an opportunity to challenge my leadership style, to suggest that my cultural background makes me too consensus-oriented for aggressive market expansion." The irony was striking. The same cultural differences Miyuki's company helped others navigate were being weaponized against her by people who should have recognized their value. Jack felt a surge of protective anger on her behalf, though he knew she needed strategic thinking rather than emotional reactions. "What's your plan?" he asked, confident she wouldn't have raised the issue without having already formulated potential approaches. "I need to demonstrate that the Educational Center isn't just a charitable side project, but integral to our core mission," she said, determination hardening her expression. "And I need to show it can be financially sustainable more quickly than current projections indicate." The meeting itself wasn't what concerned Jack. Miyuki's strategic intelligence and boardroom experience far exceeded his own. What troubled him was the glimpse of vulnerability beneath her professional armor, the recognition of how isolated she remained despite her success. "Let me help," he offered simply, "not as an employee following orders, but as someone who believes in this vision as much as you do." The relief in Miyuki's expression revealed how rarely she received such offers, how accustomed she'd become to shouldering burdens alone. "I was hoping you'd say that." Over the next 48 hours, they worked in intense collaboration, developing a revised implementation plan that accelerated the center's revenue-generating programs while preserving its core educational mission. Jack leveraged his practical engineering experience to identify construction efficiencies, while Miyuki reworked financial projections, to highlight long-term benefits that transcended immediate profit concerns. When the board meeting finally convened, Jack attended as technical implementation director, prepared to address specific questions about the center's design and technology integration. What he hadn't anticipated was being called upon to speak to the project's broader significance. "Tell us, Mr. Reynolds," the board chairman prompted during a critical moment in the discussion. "You've worked in both Japanese and American corporate environments, in both white-collar and blue-collar capacities. Why should this company invest millions in an educational center when we could be accelerating our commercial products instead?" The question created a sudden silence in the boardroom. Jack felt the weight of multiple gazes, the skeptical assessment of board members, Miyuki's careful neutrality masking what he recognized as concern. This wasn't merely about construction timelines or budget allocations, but about the company's soul, the values that would guide its evolution beyond immediate profit motives. Jack took a breath, organizing his thoughts before responding. "I spent 5 years in Japan learning that effective cross-cultural communication isn't a luxury, it's a necessity for solving complex problems. The technical solutions we're also focused on, they fail without cultural context. They become expensive mistakes without human understanding behind them." He gestured toward the architectural renderings displayed on the boardroom screen. This center isn't separate from your commercial goals, it's the foundation for them. You're creating the next generation of problem solvers who understand both technical specifications and human needs. You're building your future workforce, your future partners, and your future customers. Several board members shifted uncomfortably as Jack continued, his voice gaining confidence. I've been on both sides of cultural misunderstanding. I've seen million-dollar projects fail because American engineers couldn't grasp Japanese decision-making processes. I've watched brilliant ideas go nowhere because their creators couldn't translate them across cultural boundaries. He turned directly to the chairman, whose skepticism remained evident in his furrowed brow. You're asking if this is a wise investment. I think the better question is whether you can afford not to invest in this foundation. Technology changes constantly, but the human need to understand each other across differences, that's eternal. And companies that recognize that reality will outlast those fixated on quarterly returns. The silence that followed felt electric. Jack wondered if he'd overstepped, if his passion for the project had pushed him beyond appropriate boundaries for his position. But when he glanced at Miyuki, he caught the briefest smile, a flash of approval, quickly masked by professional restraint. The discussion continued with renewed focus, board members engaging more substantively with the educational vision rather than dismissing it as a charitable distraction. By meeting's end, they had approved the modified implementation plan with the stipulation of quarterly progress reviews, a compromise Miyuki readily accepted. As the board members dispersed, several paused to speak with Jack, engaging him on specific aspects of cultural integration he had mentioned. The chairman lingered longest, his initial skepticism evolving into grudging interest in Jack's experiences navigating Japanese corporate culture. When the room finally emptied except for Jack and Miyuki, she closed the door and leaned against it, exhaling a breath she seemed to have been holding throughout the meeting. That was unexpected, she said, studying him with an expression he couldn't quite interpret. I spoke out of turn, Jack admitted, suddenly concerned he had overstepped boundaries. I should have stuck to technical specifics rather than philosophical foundations. Miyuki shook her head slowly. No, you spoke exactly what needed to be said in exactly the way it needed to be heard. I've been making these arguments for years, but coming from me, they sound self-serving. The Japanese-American CEO pushing her cultural agenda. Coming from you, she paused, searching for the right words. You built a bridge they could actually cross. You translated the vision into terms they could understand and value. It's exactly what I hired you to do. I just didn't expect to need those skills in the boardroom. Relief mingled with lingering concern as Jack processed her response. I'm glad it helped, but I don't want to complicate your leadership position. If I overstep, Miyuki closed the distance between them, her professional reserve giving way to something more personal. You didn't overstep. You reminded me why I started this company in the first place, not just to build technology, but to build understanding. Sometimes I get so caught up in corporate strategy that I lose sight of the original vision. She hesitated, vulnerability evident in her expression. Thank you for seeing what I'm trying to build, and for helping me fight for it when it would have been easier to compromise. The moment hummed with unspoken significance, a recognition that their partnership extended beyond professional collaboration into something deeper, a shared commitment to values that transcended corporate objectives. Before Jack could respond, his phone buzzed with a text from Emma's teacher. The science fair had ended early, and she needed to be picked up from school. The interruption broke the moment's intensity, returning them to the practical realities that shaped their daily lives. I should go get Emma, he said, though he felt strangely reluctant to leave this conversation unfinished. Miyuki nodded, her professional composure returning as she stepped back. Of course, we can continue planning tomorrow. And Jack, thank you again for everything. As he drove to Emma's school, Jack reflected on the evolving dimensions of his relationship with Miyuki, how they moved between professional collaboration and personal connection with increasing fluidity, each context revealing different facets of the other's character and values. Emma bounded into the car with uncontained excitement, clutching a blue ribbon and certificate. First place, Dad. The judges said my butterfly tracking system has real scientific potential, and guess what? They want to feature it at the state competition next month. Her triumph pushed boardroom politics from Jack's mind as he celebrated his daughter's achievement, listening to her enthusiastic recounting of the judge's feedback and future development possibilities. Emma's natural scientific curiosity, once limited to kitchen table experiments and library books, was flourishing with access to proper resources and mentorship. As they arrived home, Emma raced inside to call Rodriguez and share her victory. Jack followed more slowly, struck by how much had changed in their lives over the past 2 months. Not just external circumstances, but internal landscapes as well. The careful boundaries he'd established after Elizabeth's death had gradually expanded, allowing new possibilities for both professional fulfillment and personal connection. Later that evening, after Emma had finally exhausted her excited recounting of the science fair and fallen asleep, Jack sat on their small patio with a cup of coffee, watching fireflies illuminate the gathering darkness. His phone buzzed with a text from Miyuki. The education center architect called with a question about the garden design. I told him our technical director would review the plans tomorrow. But that's not why I'm texting. I just wanted to say that today reminded me how glad I am that you're in my life professionally and personally. The message carried weight beyond its simple words, an acknowledgement of the deepening connection between them, a step toward naming feelings that had been developing alongside their professional collaboration. Jack typed and deleted several responses, unsure how to navigate this evolving territory. Finally, he settled on honesty. Today reminded me what it feels like to fight for something that matters. I'd forgotten that feeling. Thank you for bringing it back into my life. He sent the message before he could overthink it, before caution could override the genuine gratitude he felt for how her presence had expanded his sense of possibility. Her response came quickly. The garden design includes a concept called borrowed scenery, incorporating distant elements that aren't part of the garden itself but enhance its beauty when viewed from within. I think people can be like that too, helping us see beyond our self-imposed boundaries to possibilities we wouldn't otherwise recognize. The poetic comparison lingered in Jack's mind as he prepared for bed, this Japanese concept that seemed to capture something essential about their influence on each other's lives. How Miyuki had helped him reconnect with professional ambitions he'd abandoned, how he'd perhaps helped her remember the human foundation beneath corporate strategy. The following weeks brought accelerated progress on the Education Center, with construction timelines tightened to meet the board's revised expectations. Jack found himself dividing time between his technical integration team's ongoing projects and hands-on involvement with the center's development, particularly the Japanese garden that had become the physical and metaphorical heart of the design. Emma's science project evolved into an ongoing research initiative, with Global Bridge providing resources for expanded butterfly tracking trials in local parks. Her confidence grew alongside her technical skills, her natural intelligence, finding expression through increasingly sophisticated experiments and analyses. Through these busy days, Jack and Miyuki's relationship continued its gradual evolution, professional respect, deepening into personal trust, casual friendship, expanding towards something neither had explicitly named, but both increasingly acknowledged through small gestures and meaningful conversations. Then came the earthquake in Kyoto. Jack first heard about it from the car radio while driving to work. Initial reports of a 6.7 magnitude quake causing significant damage in areas including the historic Higashiyama district, where Miyuki had mentioned her grandmother had lived. He immediately tried calling her cell phone, but the call went straight to voicemail. When he arrived at Global Bridge, he found the office in contained chaos. Employees gathered around screens displaying news coverage, Japanese-speaking staff making urgent calls to check on family members and colleagues at their Kyoto branch office. Miyuki's assistant intercepted Jack as he headed toward her office. She left for the airport an hour ago. Her grandmother's neighborhood was hit badly, and she couldn't get through on any calls. She's on the first flight to Tokyo, then connecting to Kyoto if transportation is running. The news hit Jack with unexpected force, not just concern for Miyuki's family, but the realization that she'd departed without reaching out to him, without giving him an opportunity to offer support. They'd grown so close in recent months that her instinct to face this crisis alone without even a phone call created a hollow sensation in his chest. Did she leave any instructions about the education center? About her ongoing projects, he asked, defaulting to professional concerns to mask the personal impact of her sudden departure. The assistant handed him a folder. She left this for you, contingency plans for your review. She said you'd know which priorities to maintain in her absence. The trust implied by this delegation would have pleased him under different circumstances. Now it felt like a poor substitute for the personal connection he'd hoped had developed between them. Throughout the day, Jack maintained professional focus, reassuring team members concerned about colleagues in Japan, adjusting project timelines to account for Miyuki's absence, reviewing the detailed contingency plans she'd prepared. But beneath these practical responses, questions circled in his mind. Why hadn't she called him before leaving? Was their connection as significant to her as it had become to him? Or was he misreading their relationship entirely? When he picked up Emma from school, he explained the situation as gently as possible, knowing she'd grown attached to Miyuki through their regular interactions. Emma processed the news with characteristic thoughtfulness, immediately suggesting they research ways to help earthquake victims. That evening, as they compiled information about relief organizations, Emma looked up from her tablet with sudden intensity. Do you think Miyuki's okay? Not just physically, but inside. She told me once that her grandmother raised her after her parents divorced. That's her real family. The insight caught Jack off guard, this piece of Miyuki's history that she'd shared with Emma during their lab sessions, but hadn't mentioned to him. It contextualized her immediate departure, her prioritization of reaching Kyoto as quickly as possible. I'm sure she's worried, he acknowledged. It's hard being far away when someone you love might be in danger. Emma nodded, returning to her research with renewed purpose. Then we should help her worry less. We can take care of things here, so she doesn't have to think about anything except her grandmother. The simple wisdom in his daughter's approach cut through Jack's complicated emotions. Whatever his personal feelings about Miyuki's departure, whatever questions lingered about their relationship, the immediate priority was supporting her through this crisis practically and emotionally, even from a distance. Over the next 3 days, news from Japan trickled in through official channels and social media. The earthquake had caused significant damage in specific neighborhoods, including the historic district where Miyuki's grandmother lived. Transportation systems were disrupted and communication remained spotty in the hardest-hit areas. Jack received one brief email from Miyuki sent from Tokyo before her connection to Kyoto made it to Tokyo. Still trying to reach grandmother. Cell networks overloaded. Will update when I can. Please keep Education Center on track, especially garden installation starting this week. Construction team has revised plans. Thank you for handling things there. The message was purely practical, focused on business continuity rather than personal connection. Jack told himself this was natural given the circumstances, but the absence of any personal note reinforced his uncertainty about where they stood. He threw himself into managing both his regular responsibilities and Miyuki's most critical projects, working extended hours to ensure nothing fell behind schedule. The Education Center became his particular focus, especially the Japanese garden installation that Miyuki had specifically mentioned. When the landscape architect arrived with the revised plans, Jack immediately identified a problem. The design modifications made to accommodate construction delays had fundamentally altered the garden's flow, replacing the subtle winding pathways of the original concept with more direct routes that prioritize efficiency over experience. This isn't what she wanted, Jack told the architect, spreading the original designs beside the revisions. The whole point was to create a space that slows movement, that encourages contemplation through the journey itself. The architect shrugged with professional detachment. The construction team needs simplified hardscaping to meet the accelerated timeline. Ms. Tanaka authorized these changes before she left, technically at least. She signed off on necessary modifications to meet board expectations. Jack studied the documentation, recognizing the carefully worded language that protected the construction team while potentially undermining Miyuki's vision. She'd been under intense pressure from the board meeting, focused on demonstrating the center's viability. It was entirely possible she'd sign the authorization without recognizing how significantly these necessary modifications would alter the garden's essential character. I need 24 hours, he told the architect, before you break ground on these revisions. The request was met with obvious frustration. We're on a tight schedule here. The board is watching this project closely, and every delay, Jack cut him off with uncharacteristic firmness. 24 hours won't derail your timeline. But proceeding with these changes might derail the entire purpose of the garden. One day. That's all I'm asking. After the architect's reluctant departure, Jack spent hours researching Japanese garden design principles, consulting with Global Bridge's cultural specialists about the significance of specific elements in Miyuki's original concept. By midnight, he had developed an alternative approach that preserved the garden's contemplative pathways while still meeting construction timeline requirements. The solution required shifting other aspects of the center's development schedule, delaying the installation of certain technology components to prioritize the garden's structural elements. It was a risky reallocation of resources, especially without Miyuki's explicit approval. If the board interpreted these changes as elevating aesthetic concerns over practical functionality, it could undermine the compromises she'd fought so hard to establish. Jack stared at the revised plans, questioning whether he should proceed without direct consultation with Miyuki. She'd trusted him with maintaining her priorities in her absence, but this went beyond maintenance into active reinterpretation of those priorities based on his understanding of her deeper vision rather than her explicit instructions. The next morning, exhausted but determined, he presented his alternative approach to the construction team and landscape architect. After initial resistance, the technical elegance of the solution, the way it resolved multiple scheduling conflicts, while preserving design integrity, gradually won their professional respect. By that afternoon, they had reached consensus on implementing Jack's revised plan, with the landscape architect actually expressing appreciation for the approach's respect for traditional design principles. As they finalized details, Jack's phone buzzed with an international call, Miyuki's number appearing on the screen. He stepped away from the group, heart racing as he answered. Miyuki. Her voice came through with surprising clarity despite the distance. Jack, I finally got reliable cell service. I've been trying to reach you. Relief flooded through him at the sound of her voice at the confirmation of her safety. How's your grandmother? Were you able to find her? The slight pause before Miyuki's response telegraphed complicated news. She's alive. Her house sustained significant damage, but she was at a community center when the quake hit. She's currently in the hospital with some injuries, but the doctors expect full recovery. Thank God, Jack breathed genuine gratitude in his voice. And are you okay? Another pause longer this time. I'm managing. The neighborhood I grew up in is badly damaged. So many landmarks from my childhood are just gone. It's disorienting seeing familiar places transform so completely. The vulnerability in her voice created an ache in Jack's chest. Recognition of how traumatic such displacement must be, especially for someone who had already navigated so many cultural and geographical transitions. I wish I could be there, he said, simply the words emerging before he could analyze their implications. To help, or just to be with you through this. The silence that followed stretched long enough that he wondered if the connection had failed. Then Miyuki's voice returned softer than before. I wish that too. More than I expected to. When I got on that plane, I was operating on pure emergency response. Get to my grandmother, assess the situation, handle what needs handling. But these past few days in the quieter moments, I've found myself wishing you were here. Your steadiness, your practical problem solving. Just you. The admission created a current of connection that somehow bridged the physical distance between them, transforming their relationship in ways neither had explicitly articulated until this moment of crisis. Before Jack could respond, Miyuki continued, her voice shifting toward more immediate concerns. But I need to stay here longer than expected. My grandmother will need care during recovery, and there are community relief efforts I want to support. I've been worried about the education center, especially with the board watching so closely. How are things progressing there? Jack hesitated, uncertain whether to share his intervention with the garden design given her current stress. But their relationship had been built on honest communication, on recognition of each other's values and priorities. There's been a situation with the garden installation, he admitted, proceeding to explain the proposed design changes and his alternative solution. I made some executive decisions in your absence. If you disagree, we can still revert to the construction team's approach, but I was concerned that the revisions would fundamentally alter what you were trying to create. He waited for her response with growing apprehension, aware that he'd made significant decisions without explicit authorization, potentially undermining her leadership authority during her absence. When Miyuki finally spoke, her voice carried an emotion he hadn't anticipated. Not frustration or concern, but profound gratitude. You protected what mattered, she said softly. Not just the schedule or the budget, but the heart of the project. You understood what I was trying to build, even when I wasn't there to explain it. The relief in her voice suggested this affirmation extended beyond the specific garden decision to something more fundamental about their connection, a recognition that he truly saw her vision, her values in ways others might not. Their conversation continued for nearly an hour, covering practical updates about global bridge operations and more personal observations about Miyuki's experience in post-earthquake Kyoto. As international calling rates ticked away, neither seemed willing to end this tenuous connection across thousands of miles. Finally, practical concerns intervened. Miyuki needed to return to the hospital for her grandmother's treatment update, and Jack had promised to pick up Emma from her after-school science program. As they prepared to disconnect, Miyuki's voice took on a new urgency. Jack, when I come home, whenever that happens, I think we should talk. About us. About what's been developing between us beyond work. I've been avoiding naming it, trying to keep professional boundaries clear. But being here, seeing how quickly familiar things can disappear, it makes you reconsider what matters, what's worth acknowledging while you have the chance. The directness of her statement created a corresponding clarity in Jack's response. I'd like that, very much. And Miyuki, take the time you need there. Emma and I will keep things running here. You're not alone in this, even from across the ocean. After they disconnected, Jack stood motionless for several moments, processing the conversation's significance. The crisis had accelerated something that had been gradually building between them for months, moving their relationship from implicit understanding to explicit acknowledgement, from cautious exploration to deliberate choice. As he drove to collect Emma from school, Jack realized how profoundly his life had transformed since that first charity dinner, not just in external circumstances, but in his willingness to risk vulnerability again to build connections beyond the safe boundaries he'd established after Elizabeth's death. Emma greeted him with her usual enthusiasm, immediately peppering him with questions about the butterfly tracking data she'd collected that afternoon. As they drove home, she suddenly shifted topics with her characteristic directness. Did Miyuki call? Is her grandmother okay? Jack nodded, still processing the multiple dimensions of their conversation. She's in the hospital, but expected to recover. Miyuki will need to stay in Japan longer than she planned to help her. Emma considered this information with serious contemplation. We send her something. Not flowers, they wouldn't last the trip, but something that shows we're thinking about her. Something that matters. The suggestion resonated with Jack's own desire to offer tangible support despite the physical distance. What did you have in mind? Emma's expression grew determined, a sign she'd been considering this question extensively. I have an idea, but we'll need help from the engineers at Global Bridge, and maybe from Mr. Rodriguez too. As she outlined her concept, a project combining technical innovation with personal meaning, Jack felt a surge of pride in his daughter's emotional intelligence, her instinctive understanding of how to bridge physical and cultural distances through gestures that spoke to both heart and mind. Their evening transformed into a planning session, with Emma sketching designs and Jack making calls to enlist necessary assistance. The collaborative project provided focused purpose, a constructive channel for their concern for Miyuki and her grandmother. Later, as Jack tucked Emma into bed, she looked up at him with uncharacteristic hesitation. Dad, when Miyuki comes back from Japan, is everything going to change again? The question revealed the underlying anxiety beneath her apparent enthusiasm for their evolving relationship with Miyuki, the natural concern of a child who had already experienced profound loss about the stability of her remaining parents' emotional connections. Jack sat on the edge of her bed, choosing his words carefully. Some things might change, Em. But the important things, you and me, are home, the people who care about us, those stay constant even when circumstances shift around them. He brushed hair from her forehead, recognizing the courage it had taken for her to voice this concern. What do you think about Miyuki becoming a more permanent part of our lives? Emma considered the question with characteristic seriousness. I like her. She doesn't talk to me like I'm just a kid. She explains real things instead of making them simple. And she makes you laugh more than anyone except me. She paused, vulnerability evident in her expression. Do you think Mom would be okay with it? With Miyuki being important to us? The question struck deep, touching the grief that still lived within both of them, despite the years that had passed. Jack thought carefully before answering, wanting to honor both Elizabeth's memory and the potential future unfolding before them. I think Mom would want us to be happy, he said finally, to build a life filled with people who care about us, who challenge us to grow, who help us become our best selves. She wouldn't want us to stay frozen in grief forever. Emma nodded slowly, absorbing this perspective. Then I think it would be good if Miyuki became more than just our friend. As long as we still remember Mom, too. We'll always remember her. Jack promised, his throat tightening with emotion. She's part of who we are, who we'll always be. As Emma drifted towards sleep, Jack remained beside her, watching the peaceful rhythm of her breathing and contemplating the conversation with Miyuki earlier that day. Life rarely unfolded according to careful plans or neat timelines. Sometimes transformation came through unexpected detours. A charity dinner that he'd reluctantly attended, an earthquake thousands of miles away, a child's simple question about friendship. The path ahead wasn't clearly marked, with no guarantees of smooth passage. There would be complications, practical, emotional, cultural, in whatever evolved between him and Miyuki. But sitting beside his sleeping daughter, Jack felt a certainty he hadn't experienced in years, that some journeys, despite their inherent risks, were worth embarking upon. That sometimes the bridges we most need to cross are the ones that connect not just different cultures or experiences, but different possibilities for our own lives. The person we've been, the person we are, and the person we might yet become.